I will switch gears now to introduce our second speaker, Wren Lanier. Wren is the head of product design at the company called Apiture. She is local here in Durham, North Carolina, and helps teams translate user insights into continuous product improvements. She's highly skilled at user experience and user interface design. And along her many years of experiences, she has more than 5 years specifically working with the technology startups. And with that work, Wren created the model for user experience research. And that's the topic that she's willing to share with us in her today's talk. Move fast, learn stuff. Love the topic, Wren. Please take the stage.
Okay. Y'all, it's drink o'clock. Let's see if we can chat a little bit more about research. I've got my bourbon poured already. So yes, I am Wren Lanier. I lead the UX and product design. I lead the UX and product design team for Apiture. We are a banking technology fintech company that's based in Wilmington, North Carolina, so down at the coast. They're a spinoff connected to Live Oak Bank, which some of you may have heard of. And I lead and manage a team of 4 other product designers, and we sit inside the larger product team at Apiture. Apiture is agile-ish with an emphasis on the ish, but that is a different talk for a different time. Behold the last 11 years of my career. Once upon a time, I worked for Highrise, which was the CRM created by Basecamp. Yes, that Basecamp, previously known as 27 Signals. Then after Highrise, I've worked for a series of startups here in North Carolina, some of which you are likely familiar with. And I tell you all of this, number one, so that you understand what an absolute sucker I am for taking jobs at startups. Some people jump out of planes for fun, and this is what I do instead. But number two, so that you can, contextualize my experience and perspective, because I don't typically work in the enterprise, and that is not an accident. That's on purpose. That's also a talk for another time. So I'm a product and UX design leader. I work almost exclusively in startups or small software organizations, and I have a background in lean UX, working with Jeff Gothoff and Josh Seiden in the Neo consultancy several years ago. And, so all of this has given me, I think a different and somewhat unique and opinionated perspective on UX research and the kinds of research that are necessary for a product team when it's in a growth or rapid development mode. And that's typically when a startup decides to hire someone like me, is usually when they're staffing up like ahead of that rapid scaling and growth. And that also explains why this can be like a very bumpy ride, because those growth phases, don't always go up the hockey stick as planned. So, standard disclaimer I give for all of my talks. These are strong opinions, lightly held. They are based entirely on my own experience. Your mileage may vary. Discounts not applicable on gift cards, alcohol, or lottery tickets. Tip your delivery drivers well. So, confession time. I have never worked on a software team with a dedicated UX researcher. And I've never worked on a software team that conducted UX research in particular in anything remotely like the quote unquote right or correct way. For years, I would go to UX conferences and meetups, and I would listen to talks like Basia's about stuff like 3 weeks of discovery research before you even begin the design process. How can you even begin to design if you haven't done discovery research? And I would think, well, that sounds like a new and not particularly fun way to get fired, because this is my world right here. Somebody, usually a product manager, sometimes a VP, an EVP, or even the CEO, has a list of features and requirements that they want me and my team to bring to life by Wednesday so that we can show it to the client Thursday morning. And do you think you can have a first pass so I can see it by the end of the day? Thanks. And here's my second confession. Most of the time, it works out okay. There are a lot of bad products in the world. That's right. And there are a lot of bad user experiences. But I feel pretty strongly that the reason for that isn't that those teams are skipping 3 weeks of discovery research. I think that the reason is that their incentives are not aligned to create great user experiences, right? The incentive just isn't there based on who the buyer is versus who the user is, et cetera, et cetera. That too is a talk for another time. The truth that a lot of you probably know, that folks in the UX field don't always like to admit, is that there are other ways to develop confidence besides talking to users or potential users. There are other places to pick up signal about how to improve our product, including sales and marketing conversations, looking at what our competitors are doing, taking advantage of technical innovations that our customers don't even know about. Product teams have many, many sources of input besides our users. And so when it comes to research, our focus, at least my focus, is less about building empathy with my users and more about our level of confidence and our assumptions, right? Just how important is it that we're totally right? How much risk are we taking if we just build this? What's the risk if we're wrong? When product teams are in a rapid development phase, our capacity for risk is often quite high, right? Like just build it, just get to market, and then we can polish it. When you're a product manager working in that product function, understanding that capacity for risk is key to every decision that you make. And so sometimes you don't have enough signal. You don't have a high enough level of confidence. And that's where this targeted ad hoc research comes in. It's a way to reduce risk as you move through the product journey, hopefully without slowing your team down too much. When I think about mitigating risk in our product, this is the mental model that I use for research. Is the risk in the understanding of is it in our understanding of the problem we're trying to solve, right? The problem space, or is the risk in the solution that we're building, right? Do we need to deepen our understanding on one side or the other, or do we need to validate a conclusion or a hypothesis that we already have? And I like thinking about it this way in quadrants as opposed to like a step-by-step process. That's really key for me. Because every project is different and the location of the risk can be different every time. A lot of times in my work, I can be really confident that a problem exists and that it's worth solving, but I still need to explore it in depth before I can create an effective solution. Sometimes I try over and over and over to validate my solution with customers. And then when I fail, I realize that I didn't truly understand what problem I was trying to solve, right? And then I need to move back into the problem space for a while. So there isn't always a linear path here, just like Basha was saying. My research focus is always based on whatever our priorities are and the assumptions that we have, and just being able to help my team learn what it is we need to be successful. So I'm going to dig into each of these in more detail. But before I do that, I'll just mention one thing, which is usability testing. And that usability testing is not represented in this model. It's not here in the solution space, because to me, usability testing, it's quality control. Like it's table stakes. You've got to do it. But that ultimately the usability of your product is like less important than solving an important problem and doing it well. I think we've all run across like really slick usable products that did like nothing of any value. And it's hard to remember exactly what they were because they don't tend to stick around. One of these days they're going to kick me out of the UX Clubhouse for saying stuff like that, but I think it's true. So problem validation. Once upon a time, when I was a lean UX consultant, I spent a week working with some folks who wanted to build an app that was like Pandora, but for TV recommendations. They were parents of young kids. They felt like they were always missing out on whatever like the big cultural moment was that was happening, like Game of Thrones or whatever. Every TV show that caught fire was always on season 3, and they felt like they didn't have time to binge watch or catch up. And they thought, we should make an app for that, right? We should make an app so that we know what TV show to watch and that we're not getting left out. And they were extremely passionate, extremely excited about this idea. So after a few days of ideating and exploring, I sent them out into the world to talk to people and to see if they could validate that like other people, hopefully a lot of other people, also have this problem. And can you imagine like what they discovered? almost no one else has this problem, right? Every single person that they interviewed and talked to actually has the opposite problem, which is that they have a huge list of TV shows that they want to watch and not enough time to watch them. So unsurprisingly, we did not build that app for them. Problem validation is a really important tool in our tool belt, but most of us aren't doing this like on a week-to-week basis. Like I'm certainly not. This is early startup stuff. And in that context, it can be really fun. Like if you ever have an opportunity, go and mentor at a startup weekend and you will just like get your fill of this. In the context of a more established company, it is extremely not fun. I once tried to get a job at a startup years and years and years ago, and they were building a product targeted at millennials to help them figure out which charities or nonprofits to donate money to. And they raised multiple millions of dollars in funding. And instead of hiring me, they hired my mentor to be their director of UX, which in retrospect was probably a very good decision. And he spent weeks and weeks going out into the world trying to validate that this problem exists, doing interviews, looking for signals that millennials, who are famous for their huge quantities of disposable income, needed an app to tell them where to donate money. And surprise, he couldn't validate that problem. Of course he couldn't. And none of the founders of the company that he worked for wanted to hear it. They didn't even want to hear one word of that right up into the day that they shut down and evaporated every dollar that had been invested in them. So it's good to know about this. It's good to have it as a tool in our tool belt. But if you're working in an established company, and by an established company, I mean you own more than 2 desks of office furniture, there is no glory here, right? And if you find yourself working for someone else on a problem that is not really a problem, I would urge you to focus your effort towards finding new employment rather than trying to find a problem to solve. Now, let's talk about problem discovery and understanding. This is our bread and butter, right? Most of us are not doing this well, but most of us are probably doing this at least a little bit. If you have customers, you're getting their feature requests. You're hearing about those pain points. If you work with a UX designer or a researcher, they're probably out there doing interviews, bringing in this kind of data and insights and feedback. And my advice to you here is simply to be intentional. When you have a complex problem to solve, you want to hurry past it and keep moving, but it can be worth spending some time to make sure you understand that problem in all of its dimensions. I work in banking, right? And my subject matter expertise in banking is that I have several bank accounts, all of which appear to just leak money. And that's it. That's all I've got. So, when I'm tasked with designing something like finance reporting tools for small businesses, that's a problem that I need to explore, right? I don't know the first thing about the kinds of balance reports that business comptrollers need to run, on a day-to-day basis. I don't know what they're trying to accomplish. I'm not going to design a good solution without increasing my understanding, right? There's too much risk there with a feature that complex. But when I do these interviews, just like Basha was saying, I always want to keep that mindset of understanding the problem and not immediately getting attached to a particular solution. And that is so hard. That is the hardest thing, keeping that open mind. But it's powerful to just stay focused on understanding the problem that the user has, understanding what they're trying to accomplish and why. And when you develop that kind of pure understanding in that problem space, it really unlocks a lot of power as you move into the solution space. So I mentioned on the previous slide that for most of us, the bulk of our activity is happening in that problem discovery space. We tend to neglect research in the solution space for a lot of reasons. Often it's because the solution is decided for us, right? And when the solution was decided for you by someone much higher on the org chart, they may not be interested in validating their assumptions or learning that their assumptions were wrong. Executives, just like startup founders, do not want to hear that their baby is ugly. And sometimes, in some extreme cases, even your UX team could be a hindrance here, because in order to validate a solution, you need to have designs, right? You need some mock-ups, you need some prototypes. And I know UX practitioners at this point will tell you it's time to usability test, right? It's like that tyranny of usability testing. But you've got to move into a validation stage first. But I know that a lot of folks have to work very hard within their organization on multiple fronts just to like build support for this work. So what does solution validation look like? It looks like putting some designs together, taking it out to folks like your customers or your potential customers who have that need or the problem that it's supposed to solve. And it means listening to their feedback, right? If I'm designing those finance reporting tools, we'll put a prototype together, we'll put it in people's hands. We'll ask questions. What do you like about this? What would you change about this? Oh, you want custom date ranges? Oh, you want to save your custom date ranges, right? Taking notes. Solution validations is not, getting on a call with one of your customers and saying, oh, hey, we think we might build custom reporting in Q3. Like, would you like that? And, your customers could be like, oh, yeah, we'd like that. No, that's not it. That's not validation. Solution validation means you get all the way into the details of the solution, right? All the way into some of the clickable interactions, into designs and prototypes, and then you validate that it's valuable to the people who you think will need it. Now, I want to talk about solution discovery and understanding, because I think this is kind of a dark horse, this quadrant. Basha was talking about, you go broad in the problem space and then you converge in the solution space. I think there's actually a lot of value to doing divergent thinking in the solution space, but it's tricky. And it's something that almost none of us are doing, but all of us ought to be doing more of. The big reason we don't do it is because, one, like we talked about, product teams are usually given a solution, or at least the expectation of a solution, right? Somebody tells us, you need to launch this thing in Q3, and whoever drops that onto the roadmap has already decided what thing is, and they've prioritized the most important features, et cetera, et cetera. And you may feel like you don't have room to adjust or to explore alternatives. And that's a culture problem, not a process problem. Another reason that we don't do this work is that tactically, it can be tricky. It's usually a combination of interviews and experiments and maybe ideation workshops. Not everyone gets excited about putting Post-it notes on a wall. I guess I understand that. I don't know. It's hard to relate. The other issue that we don't talk about enough is that if you are purely focused on finding the best solution to a problem, you may come up with a solution that's outside of your business wheelhouse. And that becomes a big issue. I often think about that couple that wanted to build an app to make TV recommendations. And I think that instead of an app, it should have been a newsletter, right? It should have been a newsletter for busy parents of young kids. And it could be TV recommendations and product recommendations and who knows what else. Like if they just focused on solving that problem, they could have come up with something small and cheap, but potentially profitable, but it wouldn't be an app. It wouldn't be software. And they really, really, really wanted to build an app. If you've got the time, it can be incredibly valuable to generate ideas, especially with some of your users and customers, by showing what I would call a straw man prototype. Put together some designs, but don't get attached to them. Sometimes I will do this and I will even make the designs deliberately bad. Like I will leave out a feature on purpose to see if users notice, to see if they ask for it, or to see if they ask for something else instead, right? Sometimes we just put together ideation workshops within our team. You can include users in those workshops as well if you have access to them like that. There are lots of tactics that you can use here, but you have to get creative. And you have to keep the mindset that you're not just finalizing and solidifying around one idea, but that you're trying to generate lots and lots of different ideas. Final thoughts. When you go through this work and when you're trying to mitigate risk and when you do these research activities, I always think it's important to try and assign each research activity or effort to just one quadrant. One of the mistakes I see even experienced UX research teams make is that they will link the problem and the solution because again, their client has come up with a solution that they want to build. And so the UX team will go out and they will validate that the problem exists. They say, yay, we want to build the solution. And yeah, the problem exists. It's like, yeah, but just because the problem exists and is real doesn't necessarily mean that the solution is good or the best, right? But those things get tied together. So as you do activities, really think about, am I trying to validate or understand the problem, or am I trying to validate or understand the solution? Be willing to hear things that cut against assumptions, whether those are your assumptions or your stakeholders' assumptions. Just like Basha was saying about, going back to step A instead of focusing on the step that the stakeholders wanted to work on. Be willing to hear things that might be a little bit outside of the box. Always orient yourself around learning and what it is that you need to learn to be successful, in that next milestone that your product team is working on. And push your UX team to engage on discovery and validation, and not just on usability testing. Like push them out to engage, in some of this more hypothesis-driven work if they're not doing that already. Thank you. Tight 20 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you, Wren. Very thought-provoking and great tips. Thank you very much for those. I really appreciate the humor as well and the great energy that comes from your talk. My favorite quote that I'll be repeating is be willing to hear things that cut against assumptions. That's amazing how relevant that is to a lot of user research that we are doing. Folks, please raise your hands if you have a question. By the way, I didn't mention to raise your hand. Actually, there are buttons. Yes button on the bottom of the participants list. Just click yes, and I'll see you. Or just type into the chat as you were doing. That works as well.
Questions, thoughts, concerns, bourbon recommendations. Let's see. I had rocks, but they melted. How do I deal with confirmation bias? I mean, again, I think especially if there's someone on my team who seems to really want to hear a particular thing, I will design tests and experiments, whether it's, I'll leave a feature out. I don't try and be deliberately deceptive, but, I will do experiments where I just show people a design and I say, what do you notice about this? And if we're concerned about, will users notice this particular thing? I won't ask them about that thing. I'll just ask them in general, like, what do you like about this page? What do you notice? To try and see, if it comes out that they've noticed what we want them to see. So I think experiment design is super interesting, and that when you've been working in the space for a long time, like I have, I feel like I've designed just about every UI workflow possible 14 times already. So there's not as much challenge for me in actually like designing the UX anymore. That the real challenge and interest is in designing these experiments to gain insights and better understanding. Any other questions?
David, I think I tried to unmute you, but it gets back muted.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, please.
Great. So question regarding problem validation. So when trying to understand if there's a problem, and you gave the example of the Pandora for TV, sometimes you have users who know they have a problem, like, yes, absolutely. And you have some that are like, no, I definitely don't have a problem. But then there's some, maybe I do. If I had a good solution, maybe I'd use it. Did you have any rule of thumb on that group of sort of undecided, like your ability to sway them to yeah, they probably have a problem, they just don't know it?
That's so hard, because then the second piece of working on that problem validation is that, in some cases you can validate that a problem exists, but it can be difficult to quantify. But how painful really is this for people? Is it painful enough that they might buy a $19.99 a month subscription in order to solve this problem? So then it gets into that matter of, so those people in the middle, yeah, they probably have that problem, but maybe it's just not urgent enough for them to solve. And so, yeah, then I would say that becomes more of a prioritization issue, where it's like, okay, well, 20% of people seem to feel really strongly about solving this problem, and 80% of people don't. There's also a question, maybe, is there an opportunity for doing user education? Why is this not a problem for them? Like, is it that they just operate in some other space, or are they maybe like more unsophisticated users in your space and they just haven't worked their way up to needing that feature yet? So yeah, it's prioritization probably more than anything else, or just trying to move the needles on those users and their engagement. When do you have enough confidence that you've validated a solution concept? How do you know when to move on? I mean, just like Erica Hall's book is like Just Enough Research. It's about feeling that we have enough signal that we've mitigated the risk. Do we feel like we've had conversations? Do we feel like we've got a strong enough signal from enough people who we feel are, representative of our audience, that we at least feel like this is worth moving towards, like a version 1. And certainly when I work in in-house on software as a service, which is somewhat different than like an agency model, my software is never done, so I might feel like, oh, but what if we did this? Oh, but what if we did? What if we, but those ideas can go into the backlog. We can come back to those, 6 months later. We just need to feel like, is this good enough for a version 1 that this can be valuable for somebody? How do you validate real willingness to pay on the solution space without having a real product where monetary transactions can be done? So Carlos, that really gets into the lean startup space and lean experiments, and you can read about various sorts of smoke tests. I'll close everybody out. This is slightly funny and relevant with a smoke test. I heard 2 MBAs talk about 10 years ago. They had this idea about doing a nacho delivery service, right? Like, nachos brought to my door, hopefully steaming hot. How amazing! But they wanted to validate, like, what is the market for a nacho delivery service? So they went to Kinko's, and they spent $50 printing up flyers, and they like flyered a whole neighborhood. Now they flyered a suburban neighborhood, like kind of outside the city, which I thought that's ridiculous. Like, they should have stayed close to the university and close to like the college students. But they flyered this neighborhood, and on the flyer, they put a phone number. So they put together the flyer. It actually said it was like Sir Speedy's nacho delivery service. Like, they made this whole fake business that just had a Google Voice phone number, and then they tracked how many calls, like how many people called the Sir Speedy's nacho delivery number to try and measure like the level of interest in a nacho delivery service. I think experiments like that are fun, and they're fun to hear about when you're talking about the idea of like a brand new startup. But one of the things I've always struggled with in like lean and lean experiments in particular is that when you're operating in a real business environment and we have like real customers who are paying us real money, we can't just lie to them about Sir Speedy's nacho delivery service. So again, you get into that like creativity space of how do we design, experiments where we're not just like straight up lying to our customers. But yeah, those smoke test ideas are interesting, and if you read articles about lean in particular, you'll hear a lot more about those. How is the startup space in general in RTP? Recently moved from California and wondering, not seeing much buzz about stock options, acquisitions, IPO. Yeah, I mean, the startup space is good enough here. Like, I would say mostly more like the technology space in general and the startup space. It's good enough that you can, you can stay employed, knock on wood. We're in one of the worst economic crises in like 100 years. But it's good enough that if one of your startups goes under, you can usually find new employment in like the next couple of months. You're not going to see California type stock options and everybody, it's late. So I'm just going to say it. I don't know that many people in North Carolina are making what they would call fuck you money, like they do in Silicon Valley, where like you're just going to get rich and never have to work for anybody else again and just make it rain. There's probably only a handful of people here in North Carolina who've done that, and they were all founders. I don't know about any early employees who've gotten that rich here, but maybe I've missed a story.
If I may, can I add to this comment?
Yes.
I'm gonna use this as an opportunity to pitch in the meetups.
Yeah.
I honestly myself been pretty gloomy about perception of the area as a startup-y till I started joining the meetups like this one, and you start meeting people and you start talking to them and realize how much is actually going on that you just don't hear about just listening to the news and seeing the business journal updates. There's a lot of stuff that's going on that is really fun, it's really innovative. So come and talk to folks.
Yes, it is in terms of companies and opportunities and the ability to stay employed working on interesting projects. I think it's very good, but so far I don't know, no place really compares to the kind of funding and money, and exits, the sort of size of the exits that the West Coast companies tend to make.
Agreed.
Yeah.
But may I suggest to give Wren a break? That was quite a lineup of questions. Great questions. Thank you, guys. And I would like once again to give big thanks to both of our speakers. Have been great and very insightful knowledge share. Thank you, Wren, and thank you, Basia. And thank you everyone for joining. That's been a great participation for our virtual meetup. And we'll keep you updated on our next meetups and hope to see you face to face soon enough. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.
Bye.